Well, good evening. First, I want to apologize for promising to get this episode up before now, and I sent out a little video a short while ago. Said I was having computer software problems, and I think I have those mostly fixed or cured now. So I'm going to give it a try on putting up this episode. And this is the Dixie raising series. I've completed 2 episodes before. This will be the 3rd episode, and in this episode I promised to tell you about moving to the old church. The title of this one is Moving to the Old Church. But before I get into that, I'd like to go back and maybe fill in a little bit more in the background, and I think I need to say more about my ancestors, and that would make everything a little more clear, I think. And I'd like to drop again back as far as my 3rd great grandfather, who first moved into this area as a settler, as a pioneer, when it was still wild country and when there were still Native Americans around, and pioneer days for this part of the country. I'd like to say something about the size of the families back in those days. And my grandfather and grandmother married. My grandfather was, 3rd great grandfather was quite a bit older than my 3rd great grandmother. I think he was about 28 years old and she was only 14 when they married. And they bought land in some of the early land grants, as I described before, up in one of the coves in this county, and set up housekeeping on a farm and started to raise a family. And the point I want to make about that is how large the families were back then. My 3rd great grandmother started having children not too long after they married. She had 1 child every 2 years for 24 years. And that was just like clockwork. I have the records that show when those children were born, because one of those children, James, was my 2nd great grandfather. But anyway, she had 12 children, and all those children lived to be adults, and many of them lived late into life. So a large family. And the reason for it back then, if they had a farm, they needed the help on the farm, and the older ones grew up a little and helped take care of the younger ones. Anyway, that was my first ancestor that I knew in this area, was a family of 12 children. I don't remember right now how many boys and how many girls. But coming on down to my own parents, even in the early part of the last century, there's still very large families in this area. There's still a rural area, still a lot of farming going on, and still a lot of large families. On my mother's side of the family, they were 8 children in her family. There were 4 boys and 4 girls. On my father's side of the family, there were also 8 children, and again there were 4 boys and 4 girls. And at present day, on my mother's side, none of those children are still alive, including my mother. She passed away in about 1980. On my father's side, all of his brothers have gone. He's the remaining male in the family, and only one of his sisters have gone. So there's still 3 sisters living even at this time. And as I've said on some of my other videos, my father will be turning 91 years old this month, just a couple of weeks from now. So that's a little bit more information about the families, and that'll make sense a little later on. And one thing also that I'll go into more detail about, one thing I want to say is maybe the location of the farm, my grandfather's farm, where I was born. There might be a little bit of confusion there, because I spoke of my father living on a bottomland farm downriver when he and my mother married, and then I didn't fill in the blanks between then and me being born on the farm, which was far away from the river, and on about 15 miles to the north of that original farm. And what fills in the blanks there is that the Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, came in this area in the early 1930s and started buying up bottom land, farmland, and the purpose for that was they were building dams on the Tennessee River to control it, and all of those bottomland farms, some fine, rich farmland, were to be covered by water, and that happened in the late parts of the 1930s. So after my parents married and lived on that bottomland farm, the whole family had to move off and move to another farm out of the land that would become Lake Gunnersville and be flooded by the building of a dam downstream. So at this time my grandfather moved to this farm, a quite large farm. I don't remember if it was 160 acres or 240 acres, but anyway, a big farm. And it was located near the town of Hollywood, Alabama, and located in the community of Fairfield. And back in those days, I don't guess there was very good maps, and folks just named the areas how they wanted to. But anyway, that area of Fairfield was named because there was a Fairfield Baptist church nearby. So his farm was near that Fairfield Baptist church. And later, I don't know how many episodes, I'll also come back and I want to talk more about my grandfather's farm, because that was kind of a center point for our family. And back in those days, families, I think, were closer, spent more time together, and just about every weekend and every holiday, my family, speaking of myself, my brother, my mother and father, would be at my grandparents' house, sometimes to spend the weekend, sometimes to visit, and all of the other brothers and sisters of his would be there, and all the children and the cousins would get together, and that was a high point, a memorable point in my life. And I remember a whole lot about his farm, and I want to describe in later issues that farm and some of those family get-togethers we had at that time. But anyway, in this episode I was to talk about moving from the cabin and moving on to our second house. And again, this was in 1945. I was born in November 1945. And we made it through the winter. And I don't know for sure, but I think we lived there most of the next year. And I think that because I know crops are planted in the spring and they're not harvested into the fall, and my father would have been needed on the farm to help with the crop labor. But I also think he realized that now he had a family of 2 children and a wife to support. And we were living in a house with no utilities, no improvements, just a very rough living condition. And I'm sure there was conversations that we need to move on and find a better house and something a little more convenient. And I just said the next nearby town, or organized town, was Hollywood, which was only about, couldn't be more than 4 or 5 miles from where I was born, there at the foot of that mountain, of Poorhouse Mountain. So, and I'm sure my father and mother talked about we need to go on beyond the farm, because I think the only rewards on the farm was helping out the grandfather and probably having a place to live and food to eat, which, considering the hard economic times, that was not bad. But I'm sure he realized he needed to start some kind of outside income. So I think that initiated that move to Hollywood. And when they did that, I would have been probably getting close to 1 year old, so I wouldn't remember a lot about that. But we lived in that next house long enough. I do remember some things about it, and I'll try to tell some of those memories here in this part. But I want to describe the house we moved into, and I said old church, and that's truly what it was. There was an old original wood frame, wood-sided church built there in Hollywood. And evidently the congregation had gotten well enough off to build a better church and move on, and it left this old church vacant. Now I don't know if the church still owned it or it was sold to an outside landlord or what. But anyway, somebody took this old church, and it's not a very big church. And I'll show I actually have a recent photograph of the old church, the way it looks now, which doesn't look like a church. But I also have another picture of a similar, what I think that must have looked like when they, at that time, which would have been 1945.